Imagine for a second driving into a community where the poverty is so severe, so just distinctly physical in its shape, that it genuinely haunts you for the rest of your life.
Yeah, like not just a neighborhood going through a temporary economic downturn.
Exactly. Not a tough cycle.
Yeah.
A place that looks like it has been systematically carved out of the surrounding world, just left to wither entirely.
Right.
And Nick McKenzie saw this. He saw this as a boy.
Yeah, it's such a powerful anchor for all of this.
It really is. So he was sitting in the passenger seat of his father's car, right? They were driving through northern Wisconsin. They were going to visit a childhood friend of his in a place called the Sand Lake Community.
And we should note, Nick is someone who has traveled extensively throughout a very long life.
Right. From the Midwest up to Alaska, he's seen a lot of the world.
But he notes this memory with a kind of a quiet astonishment.
Yeah.
He says he has never seen poverty quite like what he witnessed that day in Burnett County.
And what he was looking at, and this is crucial for you listening, it wasn't the result of a local recession.
No.
It wasn't a factory closing or just some stroke of bad luck. He was literally looking at a community that had been legally deleted from the United States.
Deleted? Yeah, it forces a total reevaluation of how we understand historical harm.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because usually when we study injustices faced by Native nations, we look for a broken promise, right?
Exactly. We look for the treaty, written in ink, signed by two sovereign governments. And then we look for the exact moment the United States military or the federal government just violated that text.
A clear narrative of betrayal.
Right, a betrayal you can point to on paper. But what Nick witnessed at Sand Lake was the downstream result of something, well, entirely different.
And arguably a lot more insidious.
Absolutely. He was looking at a community destroyed not by a broken promise, but by a promise that was simply never made at all.
The void of a promise.
Yes, the void.
So we're doing a deep dive today into the St. Croix Chippewa. They're a band of the Ojibwe. We're looking at this incredibly strange, quiet injustice that swallowed them for almost a century.
And to understand the mechanics of this, how people get erased by paperwork, or really the lack of it, we have to be incredibly precise about where we are.
Yes, geography is everything here.
Yeah.
So Nick was visiting the Sand Lake community,
Right.
which is the modern headquarters of the St. Croix in Wisconsin. But the bureaucratic trap that caused the destitution he saw, that actually stems from a tragedy at a completely different but very similarly named place.
Big Sandy Lake.
Right, over in Minnesota. So we have two different lakes, two different states. Wisconsin Sand Lake, Minnesota Big Sandy Lake.
And keeping that distinction clear is going to be essential as we go on. The resemblance of the names is this poignant historical echo, but they represent two entirely different chapters of the story.
Different chapters entirely.
Because the distance between those two lakes was literally weaponized.
Wow. Okay, so to understand what the St. Croix eventually lost, we really need to start with what they had, right?
Yeah.
How they lived.
Definitely. So for centuries, the St. Croix of Ojibwe lived along the St. Croix River Valley. This is right on the border of what is now Wisconsin and Minnesota.
And it's a very specific ecosystem.
Oh, highly specific. It's defined by these dense forests, complex waterways, and crucially, wild rice.
Wild rice.
Yeah.
Which isn't just a food source for them. I mean, it's embedded in their very identity.
Completely. In their own language, they are the Menominee Keshinyag.
The ricing rails.
Right. Which roughly translates to the ricing rails. It refers to these small birds that live out in the wild rice marshes.
So when your name is inextricably linked to the actual flora and fauna of a specific watershed, your claim to that land isn't just about real estate.
No, not at all.
It's about spiritual and physical sustenance.
They were just completely integrated into that geography. But then, by the 1830s, the United States government begins to look at that exact same geography with a very, very different set of priorities.
They weren't looking for wild rice.
No, the expanding American empire did not care about wild rice. They were looking for the raw materials of industrialization and settlement.
Which means timber, first and foremost.
Right. The St. Croix River Valley was blanketed in these massive old-growth white pine forests.
And white pine was basically the foundational building material for the westward expansion of the U.S., right?
And you couldn't build the new cities without it.
So the government steps in to secure it. And this leads to the 1837 Treaty of St. Peter's.
Often called the White Pine Treaty by historians.
Okay, so the St. Croix, along with other Ojibwe bands, they cede this massive portion of the St. Croix watershed to the U.S. government.
Right. And then, just 5 years later, the government's focus shifts underground.
Copper.
Exactly. They realize there are these massive copper deposits further north, so that triggers the 1842 Treaty of La Pointe.
The Copper Treaty.
Right, where the bands cede the Lake Superior copper country.
And if you just stop the historical tape right there, it looks like, well, the standard tragic narrative of indigenous displacement we're so used to hearing about.
Yeah, native nations signing over their land to this advancing empire.
But there is a massive legal mechanism embedded in these specific treaties, and it changes the entire trajectory of this story.
Right, usufructuary rights.
Usufructuary rights. Let's really break this down because it's so important.
It's the hinge of the whole story. When the Ojibwe ceded the title to the land in 1837 and 1842, they did not agree to leave.
Wait, they gave up the land but didn't leave.
Right. They legally retained the right to continue hunting, fishing, and gathering wild rice across all that ceded territory.
Okay, so usufructuary rights are basically the legal right to enjoy the use and advantages of another's property, as long as you don't destroy it.
Exactly. Short of the destruction or waste of its substance.
It's kind of like, tell me if this analogy works, it's like selling an orchard to a real estate developer. Right? But as part of the sale, you draft this ironclad permanent contract that says you and all your descendants get to keep walking onto that property and picking the apples forever.
That's actually a perfect way to look at it.
Like you don't own the dirt anymore. You can't build a house on the dirt.
Yeah.
But your way of feeding your family remains totally legally protected.
That is the exact legal reality they negotiated. And we really have to understand the Ojibwe perspective on this. They didn't view these treaties as a precursor to being evicted.
No.
No, they understood the shared land arrangement as a permanent settlement. They were being incredibly pragmatic.
It's saw the writing on the wall with the American expansion.
Exactly. They recognized the overwhelming force and the sheer numbers of the Americans, so they struck a compromise. The Americans could take the timber and the copper to build their cities, and the Ojibwe could continue to hunt, fish, and gather just as they had since time immemorial.
So it was a strategy designed entirely to allow them to stay home.
Yes, to stay in the St. Croix Valley.
But the United States government's tolerance for that kind of nuance, where Native people are wandering through, quote-unquote, American forests, hunting deer and harvesting rice, that deteriorated rapidly.
Very rapidly. By 1850, the political winds had totally shifted. Politicians and white settlers had basically decided that native presence, even if it was just for hunting and gathering, was an unacceptable impediment to total settlement.
So the orchard developer decides they don't want you picking apples anymore, despite the contract.
Exactly. And this brings us to the administration of President Zachary Taylor. In 1850, his administration issued an executive order. And the intent of this order was to unilaterally revoke those hunting and fishing privileges from the 1837 and 1842 treaties.
Just revoke them by decree.
Yeah, and to mandate the total removal of the Lake Superior Ojibwe westward all the way across the Mississippi River.
Which means those usufructuary rights were no longer seen as a compromise.
Right, Washington suddenly viewed them as a bureaucratic mistake that needed to be erased.
The arrogance of that is just staggering. I mean, the government gets the copper, they get the pine, and then they decide to just delete the single condition that made the trade possible in the first place.
But the Ojibwe didn't just pack up and leave.
Because they knew their rights.
Exactly. They knew exactly what they had negotiated. They knew the treaties guaranteed their right to stay. So they resisted the removal order.
Which presents the federal government with a massive logistical problem.
A huge one. How do you force thousands of people off their ancestral lands when they flat out refuse to move?
And when initiating a full-blown frontier war would be incredibly costly. And probably politically unpopular at that moment.
Right. So you don't use the military. You use paperwork. And you use the weather.
The weather. This is where the story takes a really dark turn. We need to slow down here because this is grave.
It really is. The government deployed a strategy of weaponized bureaucracy, and it was primarily orchestrated by two men. Alexander Ramsey, who was the governor of the Minnesota Territory, and John Woltras, the federal Indian subagent.
And they designed a logistical trap.
Yes. See, every year, as part of the treaty agreements, the federal government was required to pay the Ojibwe bands their annuities.
The cash, the food, the goods they were owed for the land.
Direct payment for the land cessions. Traditionally, these annuity payments were distributed at La Pointe, Wisconsin, right on the edge of Lake Superior.
Which made sense. La Pointe was the spiritual, cultural, and economic center for these bands. It was highly accessible. It was home.
But Ramsey and Watrous unilaterally changed the payment location. They announced that the fall 1850 annuity payments would absolutely not be distributed at La Pointe.
So where did they move it?
They said that if the Ojibwe wanted the food and money they were legally owed and desperately needed for the upcoming winter, they had to travel far to the west, deep into the Minnesota Territory, to Big Sandy Lake.
And here's that geographic distinction we mentioned. They're forcing the Ojibwe out of their Wisconsin homelands, making them trek to a remote lake in Minnesota. The intent here is just so cold-blooded.
It was entirely calculated. They wanted to draw the Ojibwe hundreds of miles west in the late fall. The explicit plan was to delay the distribution of the payments, hold these thousands of people there as the brutal winter weather set in, and essentially strand them at Big Sandy Lake.
So the logic was purely attritional.
Yes. If the Ojibwe were stranded far west of the Mississippi, freezing, starving, and totally cut off from their traditional winter hunting grounds, they'd be physically too weak to walk back to Wisconsin.
They would be forced to capitulate, to just stay in Minnesota and accept the removal order.
Exactly. It was a manufactured humanitarian crisis meant entirely to break their political resistance.
So in the fall of 1850, the Ojibwe are forced into this impossible choice. Give up their treaty payments, which means facing winter with no supplies, or make this incredible journey.
And they choose to make the journey. Representatives and families from 19 different bands pack up and make this grueling trek westward to Big Sandy Lake.
And they arrived, exactly as instructed, by late October.
But then the trap snaps shut. They sit by the lake and they wait.
And wait.
Late October bleeds into November. The harsh Minnesota winter really begins to set in. The temperature plummets. The lakes begin to freeze over, which is critical because it cuts off any possibility of traveling back by canoe.
And the annuities, the vital food and money promised by the federal agent.
They do not arrive.
So you have thousands of people camped in a location that was never meant to sustain that kind of population density through a winter. They don't have adequate shelter. They don't have their winter stores.
No, they are just waiting for a government agent to appear over the horizon.
And when the government finally did arrive, which wasn't until early December, right?
Early December. And the situation just devolved from a crisis into an absolute catastrophe.
Because the supplies were useless.
The supplies they brought were disastrously inadequate. Only a fraction of the promised money was actually delivered. And worse, much of the food provisions were completely spoiled.
Spoiled meat.
Rancid meat, yes.
So the Ojibwe camps became breeding grounds for disease. Now, we should note the historical record on the exact numbers is heavily contested. Scholars like James Clifton and the researchers at the Wisconsin Historical Society have spent decades trying to reconstruct this death toll from just very sparse federal logs and deep oral histories.
It's difficult work, but the scale of the horror is undeniable, regardless of the exact number.
Yeah, roughly 400 people.
Yeah.
The conservative estimates indicate that about 150 Ojibwe died right there on the shores of Big Sandy Lake.
Yes, they died from violent dysentery caused by the spoiled government rations. They died from a devastating measles outbreak that swept through the weakened population. And they died from simple, brutal starvation and freezing.
But the dying didn't stop at the lake.
No, because the survivors looked at the situation and realized that remaining at Big Sandy Lake meant total annihilation. The only minuscule chance of survival was to attempt to walk back to their homelands in Wisconsin.
On foot.
On foot.
Yeah.
In December. In Minnesota.
Oh my God.
They were sick, they were starving, and they were carrying whatever they could. This journey back is remembered in the historical record as the Wisconsin Death March, or sometimes the Chippewa Trail of Tears.
And along that frozen trail home, walking through the deep snow, it is estimated that another 200 to 230 people died.
You combine the dead at the lake with the dead on the trail, and you are looking at approximately 400 lives lost.
And the sources emphasize a really devastating demographic detail here. A massive percentage of the victims were men.
Yes. These were the hunters, the providers, the political leaders of the bands.
The structural damage to the community was just incalculable.
The Ojibwe remember this event, and the people lost to it, as Mikwinagosiwag. They are remembered. It is a foundational trauma for them.
When you look at the sheer premeditation of what Ramsey and Watrous did, the sheer bureaucratic sociopathy of it, you would assume it worked. You would assume a blow that devastating would break the will of the Ojibwe and force them to accept removal.
Right, you'd think they would be broken, but it achieved the exact opposite. The tragedy didn't break their resistance, it forged it into iron.
They refused to leave.
The survivors were absolutely resolute that they would never, ever leave their homeland no matter what the government threatened. Furthermore, the sheer scale of the death toll just couldn't be hidden.
Word got out.
Word spread rapidly, and it sparked massive public outrage across the surrounding region.
Even among white settlers?
Yes, white settlers, local newspaper editors, state politicians, people who ordinarily might have been entirely indifferent to Native rights or who maybe even supported the removal policy previously, they were horrified by the barbarity of the starvation tactic.
So this swell of regional outrage sets the stage for what has to be one of the most incredible acts of political advocacy in the 19th century.
Chief Buffalo.
Yes, in 1852, just 2 years after the dead were buried along that trail, Chief Buffalo, the head chief of the La Pointe Ojibwe, decides that dealing with federal subagents is utterly useless. He's going to take the grievance directly to the top.
Chief Buffalo, who is also known as Keshawashki, was a profound political strategist, and he undertook this monumental mission when he was in his 90s.
In his 90s, he travels all the way from the shores of Lake Superior to Washington, D.C. to demand an audience with President Millard Fillmore.
Think about that journey in 1852.
Incredible. And he arrives in the Capitol carrying the moral weight of those 400 dead. He's backed by a massive petition of support from the white citizens of the region. He sits down with the President of the United States and demands that the 1850 removal order be rescinded.
And through sheer political force and absolute moral clarity, Chief Buffalo succeeds.
He actually gets it done.
The political pressure generated by his visit, combined with the undeniable, horrific optics of the Big Sandy Lake tragedy, it forces the federal government to capitulate. They abandon the removal policy for the Lake Superior Ojibwe entirely.
Which directly forces the government back to the negotiating table. The Ojibwe had proven they could not be moved, so the government had to figure out how to live with them.
Which culminates in the 1854 Treaty of La Pointe.
And this right here, this is the pivot point of our entire deep dive today. Because this treaty was supposed to be the triumph.
Yes. This was the document where the United States finally conceded that the Lake Superior Ojibwe got to stay in their homelands permanently.
Right. The 1854 treaty established permanent, federally recognized reservations for the various bands. Bad River, Red Cliff, Lac du Flambeau, La Courte Ore, Fond du Lac, Grand Portage. All of these bands received defined borders.
They secured their future on the map. The federal government formally recognized their sovereignty over those specific tracts of land.
So the bands that suffer the horrors of Big Sandy Lake finally got the security they essentially paid for with their lives. Except
the St. Croix.
The St. Croix.
The St. Croix were left out entirely.
This is that void we started the show with. The treaty that ended the removal crisis, the crowning diplomatic achievement that was supposed to protect everyone, just completely omitted the St. Croix band.
They were granted no reservation land, and more importantly, they lost their recognized status as a distinct sovereign band in the eyes of the federal government.
It is just the ultimate bureaucratic erasure. Now, you're probably asking why. Why were they excluded?
And the historical record actually fractures here into two primary, highly debated accounts. We need to look at both of them impartially because, honestly, the administrative result was identical either way.
Okay, so the first account. This one is deeply rooted in tribal history, and it centers on a St. Croix leader remembered as Little Buck, or sometimes just Buck.
Right. According to this narrative, Little Buck did attend the 1854 treaty negotiations. He was there, and he did sign the document.
Okay, so he signed it.
But he made a fatal administrative error. He signed his name under the listing for the La Courte Ore band rather than signing as the head of a distinct, separate St. Croix entity.
Oh, wow. And in the rigid, unforgiving machinery of federal paperwork, that placement of a signature had just catastrophic consequences.
From the perspective of the U.S. government's ledger, the moment he signed under another band, a distinct St. Croix band ceased to exist.
Because if you aren't listed on the paper as your own separate entity, you do not receive your own separate land allocation. Legally, the government considered them absorbed into the La Courte Ore.
That's the first account. Now, the second historical account paints a picture of deliberate political resistance rather than an administrative mistake.
Okay, what's the second theory?
This account argues that key St. Croix leaders intentionally boycotted the 1854 Treaty Council. They refused to even show up.
But why would they boycott the treaty that's giving out reservations?
Their logic, according to this theory, was grounded in the earlier treaties. They looked at the 1837 and 1842 treaties and said, we already hold ironclad usufructuary rights. We already secured our right to hunt, fish, and gather across this entire territory forever.
Wow.
Why would we go sign a new treaty that will inevitably confine us to a tiny, restricted reservation?
They trusted the old law to protect them, so they opted out of the new negotiations.
Exactly.
Wait, I'm really hung up on this logic, because if the second theory is true, or honestly, even if the first one is, the outcome makes zero legal sense to me.
How so?
Well, basic contract law says if I signed a contract in 1837 granting me permanent rights to an orchard, right, and then I just don't show up to a totally different real estate meeting in 1854, my absence at the second meeting doesn't magically void the first contract.
Right.
The 1837 treaty was a ratified federal document. How did the federal government legally justify stripping their rights just because their name didn't appear on a new piece of paper?
It's incredibly frustrating, but the mechanism here is the legal concept of federal recognition, and it is incredibly punitive. The U.S. government didn't argue that the 1837 rights were suddenly voided.
They didn't.
No, that they argued a much more insidious technicality. They said the entity that held those rights no longer existed.
But they didn't break the contract. They just declared the other party legally dead.
Precisely. The federal stance was that usufructuary rights belonged to federally recognized tribal nations, not to individual Native people wandering the woods. Because the St. Croix did not secure a reservation in 1854, the government declared that they were no longer recognized as a distinct political band.
And without that, recognize federal identity.
The government ruled they had no legal standing to exercise the rights guaranteed in 1837.
That is a staggering legal loophole. It's an administrative assassination.
Really is.
I mean, we spend so much time studying history, looking for the broken clause. If a tribe gets moved, we can usually point to a document and say, look at Article 3, the government violated it right here.
But the St. Croix couldn't do that.
Right. They couldn't take a piece of paper to a federal judge in 1860 and say, you are violating our treaty, because the government's response was, what treaty? You aren't on the list.
There is no broken clause because there is an absence of a document. Falling into that bureaucratic void entirely defined the daily physical reality of the St. Croix people for the next 80 years.
80 years. Let's really dig into those 80 years, because that is a lifetime, multiple lifetimes. From roughly 1854 all the way to 1934, the St. Croix entered an era where they were legally classified as landless in the very river valley their ancestors had inhabited for centuries.
To understand the gravity of that, we have to compare them to the bands that did get reservations in 1854. Even though those recognized reservations were often terribly underfunded, mismanaged, and subjected to corrupt federal oversight.
They still had something.
Right. Those bands still maintained a formal legal relationship with the United States. They received some baseline level of federal services, rudimentary health care, educational support, and rations.
And the St. Croix received absolutely nothing.
Nothing.
They were ghosts. The federal government completely washed its hands of them. But obviously, human beings don't just vaporize when a clerk crosses their name out of a ledger. The people were still physically there. So where did they go?
They lived in the margins. They dispersed and settled on small, isolated, very marginal parcels of land around various lakes in the region. Places like Sand Lake, Round Lake, Danbury, Maple Plain, and Gaslin.
And what was their legal status on that land? Because the federal government didn't own it as trust land anymore. And the St. Croix certainly couldn't afford to buy the deeds from the state or private logging companies.
The state of Wisconsin and the local white population classified them legally as squatters.
Squatters.
Now, we have to use that term very carefully. It is not a moral judgment on the character of the St. Croix people.
Of course not.
It is a precise, brutal description of the legal trap they were forced into. They were legally defined as trespassing on the exact soil their families had been buried in for generations, simply because of a missing signature in 1854.
The locals referred to them as the Lost Tribe. They were an entire society living essentially as refugees in their own home.
Yeah.
So the obvious question for you listening is, how do you feed your family?
Yeah, how do you survive?
If you have no land base to farm, you have zero federal rations or support, and you are constantly at risk of being arrested by game wardens if you try to exercise your traditional hunting and fishing rights, how do you survive for 8 decades?
You survive through intense communal resilience, and you are forced to undergo extreme economic adaptation. The community memory and the oral histories from this 80-year era focus heavily on the shift to wage labor.
They had to get jobs.
Right. The St. Croix were essentially starved into entering the cash economy of the exact society that had displaced them. To get money for food, the men had to take the only jobs available to a marginalized landless class in northern Wisconsin at the turn of the 20th century.
Logging.
Yes. They became lumberjacks, sawmill workers, and river drivers.
The cruelty of that is almost suffocating when you really think about it. Think about the economic loop here. In 1837, the St. Croix ceded the white pine forest to the United States to protect their way of life, right? By the late 19th century, because they were erased from the paperwork, the only way a St. Croix father could keep his children from starving was to walk into those exact same forests, pick up an axe for a white timber baron, and spend his life cutting down the very trees his ancestors traded away.
The land they sacrificed to save themselves became the only place they could beg for a meager paycheck. It is the purest distillation of colonial extraction mechanics.
How so? Like, break that down.
Well, first, the legal apparatus extracts the land and resources. Second, through bureaucratic exclusion, it creates a legally defenseless, destitute underclass.
Okay.
And third, the surrounding industrial economy extracts the cheap, desperate labor of that underclass to harvest the exact resources that were originally taken from them. The system feeds on itself perfectly.
It's a closed loop of exploitation. But the remarkable part of this history, and the oral histories emphasize this deeply, is that the community did not dissolve.
No, they didn't.
Despite the grinding poverty of the logging camps, despite the constant threat of eviction as squatters, despite a full century of the federal government basically pretending they didn't exist, the families held together.
They stayed anchored to those specific lakes. They passed down their language, their stories, and the memory of the rights they were actually owed. They simply refused to accept the government's declaration that they were extinct.
And that profound endurance eventually collided with a massive shift in federal Indian policy in the 1930s. For decades prior, the government's approach had been aggressive assimilation and the dismantling of tribal structures.
But the immense failure and the deep poverty caused by those assimilation policies eventually led to reform. In 1934, Congress passed the Indian Reorganization Act,
which is often referred to as the Indian New Deal.
Exactly. The IRA was fundamentally designed to reverse the assimilation policies and actually encourage tribes to revitalize their self-government and rebuild their land bases.
So for the St. Croix, this piece of legislation was basically the rope ladder out of the void.
It provided a legal pathway for unrecognized or landless groups to organize and petition for federal status. The St. Croix immediately utilized this. They drafted a formal, written constitution. They went through the grueling bureaucratic process to prove their historical continuity.
They had to prove they still existed.
Yes. And finally, after 80 years of forced, deliberate blindness, the federal government looked at the paperwork and recognized them. They were officially reestablished as the federally recognized St. Croix Chippewa Indians of Wisconsin.
But federal recognition alone doesn't put a roof over your head. It's a vital piece of paper, sure, but they still didn't own the ground they were standing on.
Right. So they immediately began the fight for a land base. And 4 years later, in 1938, they finally achieved it. The federal government acquired and established federal reservation and trust lands for the tribe.
Now, it's important to understand what this reservation looked like, because it wasn't a massive contiguous square on a map like the reservations created back in 1854, right?
No, not at all. The new St. Croix Reservation reflected the physical reality of their 80-year survival. The government essentially bought up small, disconnected, non-contiguous tracts of land that were anchored around the specific historic communities where the families had been holding on as squatters for decades.
So they formalized the margins. The reservation was built around those specific pockets of survival: Danbury, Round Lake, Maple Plain, Gaslin, and crucially, Sand Lake.
Sand Lake. The community at Sand Lake near Hertel in Burnett County became the administrative and cultural headquarters for the newly recognized tribe.
Which brings us fully back to the beginning of our deep dive.
Yes, it closes the loop perfectly, because when Nick Mackenzie was a young boy riding in the car with his father and they pulled into the Sand Lake community, he was looking at this place after recognition had been achieved.
Right. The St. Croix had their tribal status back. They had a small reservation. But Nick wasn't looking at a thriving community. He was looking at deep, crushing poverty.
Because a piece of paper signed in 1938 does not possess the magical ability to retroactively erase 80 years of institutional trauma. What Nick witnessed was not a temporary economic downturn. It was the deep, structural scarring left behind by an 80-year exile.
When you deny 3 consecutive generations of a community access to a land base, when you cut them off from federal health care, when you deny them educational infrastructure, and you force them to survive on dangerous, low-wage labor just to afford basic calories, that deprivation doesn't just add up.
It compounds.
It compounds. The destitution at Sand Lake was the direct physical sediment of the 1854 omission. You could finally put a community back on the legal map, but you cannot simply hand back the century-generational wealth, health, and security that was stolen while they were erased.
It forces us to confront how permanent the damage of bureaucratic exclusion really is, and this brings up a deeply troubling realization. The story of the St. Croix is anchored in the 19th century. It involves treaties, subagents, and handwritten ledgers. But the underlying mechanics of exclusion, the strategy of using structural choices and missing signatures to strip away rights rather than using overt violence, that did not end in 1854.
Not even close. The bureaucracy of exclusion just gets more sophisticated over time. The ink ledgers just turn into corporate charters.
Exactly. And the compiler of our sources draws a very careful, specific parallel here to a massive event in the 20th century, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971.
Universally known as ANCSA.
Right. Now, the historical context in Alaska is entirely unique, but the through line of how indigenous rights are extinguished through paperwork is undeniably the same.
Okay, so to set the baseline for Alaska for you listening, unlike the tribes in the lower 48 states, Alaska Natives were never forced into the treaty system.
No, the United States just never offered them treaties. They never fought massive frontier wars over defined borders in the same way.
But by the mid-20th century, huge reserves of oil are discovered in Alaska. Suddenly, the state of Alaska and multinational oil companies desperately need to build a pipeline, which means they need absolute, undisputed legal title to the land.
They have to resolve the Aboriginal land claims of the Alaska Natives, and they have to do it fast.
So in 1971, Congress passes ANCSA, and this legislation represents a radical departure from traditional Indian law. ANCSA did not create traditional reservations.
No, instead, it explicitly extinguished all Aboriginal land claims across the entire state of Alaska. In exchange, the federal government transferred millions of acres of land and nearly $1 billion in seed capital into a brand new, highly complex corporate structure.
It was pitched as this very modern, sophisticated capitalist solution. The government created regional and village native corporations, and the Alaska Natives themselves became literal shareholders in these corporations.
Right, the land wasn't held in trust by the government. It was owned by the corporate entities.
But buried within the architecture of that massive legislation was a structural choice that echoes the bureaucratic trap of the St. Croix omission with just chilling precision.
The legislation mandated the creation of these corporations, but it left a crucial question to be resolved. Under whose legal jurisdiction would these new Native corporations be chartered?
Would they be chartered under federal law, which would maintain a unique, direct, trust relationship with the federal government, similar to traditional tribal entities? Or would they be chartered simply as standard, for-profit corporations under the laws of the state of Alaska?
The distinction between those two options is everything. And here we have a fascinating piece of first-hand historical memory from Nick Mackenzie.
And we must state clearly here, this is Nick's personal recollection from his time living and working in Alaska during this era. This specific dynamic of the vote is his memory of events on the ground, not a universally codified public record.
Right. But according to Nick, Native representatives were actually tasked with voting on this structural choice, state charter versus federal charter.
Nick recalls that local Alaskan politicians, representing a state government and a white majority, that historically harbored deep resentment toward Native subsistence hunting and fishing rights, they lobbied incredibly hard for the corporations to choose the state charter.
Think about it like choosing where to incorporate a tech startup. Do you incorporate in Delaware or California? The location you choose dictates the entire regulatory universe you have to live under.
Right. If you choose the state charter, you are suddenly playing by the state's rules.
According to Nick's memory, the internal debate was intense, and the final vote to incorporate under the state of Alaska passed by an agonizingly narrow margin.
A single vote.
Yes. Now, we are looking at the mechanics of this vote impartially. We are not passing judgment on the political pressures or the complex motivations of the individuals in that room. What we must analyze is the undeniable, heavily documented legal outcome of that structural choice.
Because the consequence was absolute. Since the ANCSA corporations were chartered under the state of Alaska, standard state regulatory law applied to all of those settlement lands.
Why does that matter? Because under standard state law, there is no inherent protection for Aboriginal subsistence rights. The state of Alaska manages its fish and game for all citizens equally.
Okay.
That single structural reality, the choice of a corporate charter, explicitly stripped away the unique federally protected hunting and fishing rights of Alaska Natives on those corporate lands.
It's the St. Croix loophole all over again, just dressed up in a business suit. Just like the St. Croix lost their 1837 usufructuary rights because a leader's signature was placed on the wrong line of a treaty in 1854, Alaska Natives saw their vital traditional subsistence rights subsumed by state regulation because of a corporate charter choice in 1971.
By choosing the state charter, they inadvertently gave up the leverage of federal protection. They placed the regulatory survival of their traditional hunting and fishing practices, which is the core of their cultural and physical sustenance, under the direct control of a local state government that had a long documented history of hostility toward those exact rights.
The mechanics evolve, but the outcome is terrifyingly consistent. In 1854, it was an omitted name on a treaty. In 1971, it was an article of incorporation. The loss of leverage, the extinguishment of a way of life, it just boils down to being structured out of federal protection.
It is the quiet, administrative erasure of rights. You don't need the cavalry if you have a clever enough lawyer drafting the paperwork.
Wow. It really demands that we fundamentally change how we look for injustice. We are so culturally conditioned to look for the overt betrayal. We want to find the broken law, the shattered treaty, the moment the sheriff kicks the door in.
But the entire history of the St. Croix, the story of the lost tribes surviving on the margins of the logging camps in northern Wisconsin, proves that the most devastating historical forces are not the documents that are violently torn up.
No, they are the documents that are never drafted in the first place.
We followed a long road today.
We did. We started in the 1830s, looking at how the Ojibwe secured an ironclad agreement to stay in their homelands, a compromise they thought would last forever.
And we walked through the horrors of the 1850 Sandy Lake tragedy, analyzing how weaponized bureaucracy and deliberate starvation resulted in the deaths of 400 people.
We saw how the regional outrage over that mass casualty event paved the way for the 1854 treaty, a treaty that secured a future for almost everyone.
Except the St. Croix.
Right. And we traced how that single bureaucratic omission condemned them to 80 years of landless poverty, forcing them to become squatters on their own ancestral lands until they finally forced the government to acknowledge their existence in the 1930s.
The poverty that young Nick Mackenzie looked at out of the window of his father's car wasn't a failure of the St. Croix people. It was the physical shadow cast by an absent promise. It was the anatomy of an erasure.
And this history isn't just an artifact. It's an active framework for understanding how power operates today. We look at these historical examples of bureaucratic erasure, a missing signature, a corporate charter. But the administrative state hasn't gone away.
No, it has only become exponentially more complex, more digital, and more pervasive.
The paperwork might be in the cloud now, but the mechanisms of exclusion function exactly the same way.
I want to leave you, listening to this, with a thought to explore on your own. When you look at our modern, hyper-complex legal and economic systems, who is currently suffering from a quiet injustice?
It's a great question.
If you look at the gig economy, where millions of workers are legally classified as independent contractors rather than employees, they are losing access to basic labor protections, minimum wage laws, and health benefits simply because of a definitional category on a tax form.
Or if you look at the unhoused population, right? People who often cannot access basic social services, banking, or voting rights simply because they lack a permanent address to put on the required paperwork. They are literally structured out of the safety net.
Or consider the realm of digital privacy, where our fundamental rights to our own data are constantly being redefined and often surrendered by labyrinthine user agreements and terms of service that we cannot negotiate and rarely even read.
Who is being written out of the paperwork today?
Who is suffering? Not because a specific law is being broken, but because of the complete absence of legal recognition in the first place. What modern lost tribes are being created right now, quietly, in the margins of the very bureaucratic systems that are ostensibly designed to protect us?
It really makes you wonder. 50 years from now, whose poverty, whose structural struggle will a child look at out of a car window, completely unaware that they were looking at a promise we simply forgot to make?